Precisely how long is a moment?
Why are seconds secondary?
And what's the word for the day before yesterday?
It's high time we ticked off time, clocks, calendars, and chronology on an episode of Words Unravelled.
Welcome to another Words Unravelled. I'm Rob Watts from the YouTube channel Rob Words.
And I'm Jess Ferris, author of the upcoming etymology book, Useless Etymology, and it is time to get started on this episode about temporal and chronological terms, is it not?
It is. We're going to take a moment to discuss the origins of all kinds of time terms in this episode, from the second right through to the great year. We're going to cover all measure of time.
Measure. You got a lot in there. That was good.
I get quite a few in there. Another one that I didn't squeeze in that I should have tried to find a way to squeeze in is atom, because that is a unit of time that we're going to discuss.
Oh.
You may wonder how big a unit. It's a bit small one, but anyway,
we'll
get to it. The thing is with this subject, I haven't enjoyed researching a subject as much as this one in a long time, because all these words we use day to day that we take completely for granted, that have got these fascinating origins, just kept popping up. So I'm really excited about this one.
It does. It ticks a lot of boxes as we
just a tick.
it covers math, science, etymology. There's a lot of fun here.
So where do we start?
Probably with time itself, don't you think?
Yeah. So where does the word time come from?
It means basically a span or a period, but like its ultimate root, its Proto-Indo-European root, means to divide. So it is a division of something. The way we experience time, the way we divide it. So that can be days, weeks, months, minutes, seconds.
And before we were calling it time, we were calling it tide.
That's right.
Old English, right? Which refers to the movement of the seas, but also was just a general word for time. It was also the word for an hour, a word that we used for an hour before we imported the French word hour, but we'll get round to that.
I do think it's interesting that the difference between a Germanic and Old English period of time is a division versus the Latin tempus, which means to stretch. I think that's notable. Time in English, in the English sense, is less abstract and more countable. We have it, we make it, we divide it, we spend it, but we also fuge it.
Right, I see. Okay.
And one of the ways we divide it or measure its divisions is with a clock.
And there's such a run-of-the-mill word, clock.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost sounds like a clock sounds. But where does the word come from?
It's imitative of an entirely different device, and that is a bell, but an early bell, not a round one that makes a nice clanging metal sound. It's more of one that makes sort of a tick sound because it was squarer and made of like sheet metal, essentially.
Because the German word for a clock, as we know from the Glockenspiel, is Glocke. Glocken. Glocker. It's one of those. Anyway, which sounds an awful lot like clock.
It does.
Yeah.
And it is very much the same concept there. Early timepieces would sometimes use bells. And so in the 14th century, clock was adopted from probably medieval Latin, but may have been borrowed from Celtic originally.
Ooh, okay.
And then before the 14th century, Old English had a word for a timepiece that was démal, literally a day measure. Latin had the horologium. What is it? Anyway, like orology, essentially. And then the Greeks used a clepsydra, which was a word for a water thief, or literally means water thief, and was a word for a water clock.
Oh, right. Like a kleptomaniac is
exactly. It's stealing the water. You have like one bowl full of water that has a slow release of water into another thing, and you can measure time by how much water has fallen into the other vessel.
Oh, that's very clever. Okay. And so we still talk about time as being as horological, don't we? And the French word for a clock is an horloge. And
right.
We've kept this very Germanic sounding word, clock.
Water clocks I was just talking about are a very fundamental version of a water clock. There were also some extremely sophisticated and elaborate ones throughout history. Like in the Islamic Golden Age, there was the castle clock, which was a sophisticated water-powered astronomical clock, and it's been called the earliest programmable analog computer.
Oh, really?
The engineering behind them is wild. I recall seeing one in Fez in Morocco
Mm.
that had been in operation as early as like the 9th century or something, but it wasn't functional anymore. And apparently repairing it proved to be kind of a mystery.
Wow.
Or so my tour guide told me.
Well, something that I've observed as being quite interesting is what we call this thing, the little clock that we wear on our wrists, because we call it a watch, which is about us looking at it. But in other languages, the word for it means to show. So it's either you consider it that you're showing it to someone or that it is showing you the time. But I just think it's interesting that multiple languages have decided that the way to refer to this is a montre in French, right, which means show. Have decided to name it based upon the fact that it tells you the time, and not to call it something related to the time. Some languages have. German, it means the word for it is an Uhr, which is just a clock or a time. But it's weird how we see in clocks faces. I think that's the thing, right? And it's very similar to how we name a face as being a thing that looks at us. The word face is it means opposite to you, thing facing you. And so does the face of the watch, and we call it a face.
And it's got little hands.
He's got little hands, yeah, which is adorable. We've got a second hand, a minute hand, and an hour hand. Is that a neat segue into which to discuss those words?
It is amazing that the word second is the same as the word second as in number 2, right?
Yeah, that's right. The ordinal number second and the measure of time second are the same word, and it is the measure of time that comes second. So we have the ordinal number second, because ultimately the term for the unit of time comes from, there's this Latin term which is secunda minuta, right, which means second minute. And that's what they referred to seconds as to start with, second minutes. Why? Well, because if we point out that a second and a second are the same word, a minute and something minute, which are both written the same, are also the same word. Right? So the original minutes are small parts of an hour.
The minuta prima, right?
Exactly, the primary minutes. So if you then take those small parts and make them into smaller parts, you do a second reduction of them, you get to your second minutes, which are seconds, as we now call them.
So our minute is the first small part of an hour, and the seconds are the second smaller part of an hour.
There you go. There you go. You explain it even better than I could, which I think is wonderful. And we didn't have a word for second as in the ordinal number, after first in English until the Normans came and gave us a nice, lovely French word to use, that second. Before that, we were using the word other to refer to the thing that wasn't first, right? Which is obviously rubbish. And
so precise.
Yeah. And so the English language took the first possible opportunity to snatch this word from French when it came along, so that we did have something to say after first.
I think it's interesting that clocks with a minute hand didn't really appear until like the late 16th century.
Yeah, so that's the long one, right? But not the fast. That's the second hand. I just have to think these things through.
Intervals were more measured in like a vague assessment of whether it was like a quarter or half hour.
I have sometimes thought about the fact that on your clock you could get rid of all but one hand. You just keep the hour hand, right?
Right.
It does give you all the information you need, because when it's in between numbers,
just have to be better at gauging how far it's gone.
Yeah, you just need slightly better eyesight. That's all.
So how about hour then?
Hour has a really interesting relation in our language, which I'll get to in a second. But you can trace it really, really far back as a unit of the day. It goes back to Greek, which had ora. Very easy to see. Here's an interesting fact about hour. We don't pronounce the H.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the French don't pronounce the H in their word for it either, nor do the Spanish in their word for it, even though there is an H in there. It's hora. And those H's have never, in any of those three languages, ever been pronounced.
Interesting.
Never. So it was never an her in English. It was never a her in French. And it was never hora in Spanish. The H stopped being pronounced sometime way back as the Romance languages were developing.
How about in Latin? I would think so, right?
Yes.
Because we've already mentioned a related word, horology, in which it is pronounced.
Yeah, but then, as you get into the sort of the vulgar Latin languages that do become the the medieval Latin languages, the post-classical Latin languages that become French, etc., that H disappears, as H's do. It's the easiest letter to lose. These words enter the languages that they're now in without that H being pronounced, but still being written. It's kind of interesting.
This is originally a Greek word, right?
Yes, and the original Greek word is also related to year.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there you go. They share an ancient root that basically means, like a unit. The way we use it for hour, it's one of the meanings of that Greek word, which is sort of a unit of the day. But it could also be just about any other unit, right? In Greek, it's an interval, and yeah, the same source that gives us that Greek word also gives us probably the word year as well.
I'm doing a little bit of a mental stretch here, but it kind of reminds me that the word year and the German word for year and then words for hour all have that same sort of those cross language relationships, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. But you can think of the words year, day as very, very old words. As in you can trace them back for as far back as you can trace Germanic languages. Right, they go way back to Proto-Indo-European. So they're as native as they come, but at the same time, they have these relatives in other languages on different branches of the great big European family tree.
The Greek word that we've gotten, this word ultimately meant season or like a part of the day too, which is why it diverged into both a small part of the day and to a whole year. In some classical measurement systems, the day and night were divided into 12 hours each, but the hours sometimes varied in length depending on the time of the year and the amount of daylight. And it was mechanical clocks that kind of gave us the notion of a 24 equal length hour throughout the day. And that standardized that motion of time. And we've discussed in a past episode that time zones were a little wibbly wobbly until like railroads and things needed to measure, we wanted to make sure the train engine or the railway engine did not run into another one at the station.
Yeah, technology plays a big part in how quickly we develop words. However, having said that, in medieval times, they had words for units of time that they could not possibly have been able to measure. They're notional, they're mathematical concepts. But they seem to have enjoyed creating these ideas. By the way, the original minute was not a 60th of an hour, it was a 10th of an hour. So it would be 6 minutes. But anyway, that's by the by. It is what it is now. But in medieval times, there was a completely different sort of hierarchy of times that was used in England, in Anglo-Saxon England, for example. The Venerable Bede mentions the system that I'm about to talk about. And it doesn't break it up into hours, minutes, and seconds. It breaks it down ever so slightly more differently. So you still have hours as these units, because as you just mentioned, that that concept goes back a long way of breaking up the day into these 24 units. But the system that Bede talks about, let me just read to you a quote. It's not from Bede, but it's from someone a little more easy to understand, only marginally more easily to understand, referencing Bede a couple of hundred years later. So Bede's, from the 8th century. This is a quote from, when is this? 14th century. Okay. So this is a guy called Bartholomeus Anglicus, and he describes time as being made up of an hour containing 4 points. Okay. So an hour is made of 4 points. A point is made up of 10 moments. A moment is made up of 12 ounces. Ounces. And an ounce is made up of 47 atoms.
Which does this come down to to a relation to the atomic clock?
No, you might think that, but it's, well, we've talked about the etymology of atom. Mm-hmm. It can't be divided, right? That's the point. So it's the smallest thing they could think of. And there is absolutely no way that they could have measured an atom of time. So that is 0.1596 of a second.
Why?
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, 22,560 atoms in an hour, 376 in a minute. They had no chance of measuring these things, but it was interesting to them to have a concept of them. An hour is made up of 4 points, and a point is made up of 10 moments. But there is another word for a point, which being juvenile, I found quite funny.
Okay.
It was called a prick.
I mean, we get prick and point jokes throughout English literary history as well.
If you ever decide that you do wish to, opt out of the mainstream ways of measuring things, you can always switch to the points, moments, ounces, and atoms.
Your
system.
pricks and atoms.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about days, shall we? This is a very old term in English. It's been around for a long time. It's a Proto-Germanic root. It means to burn or to be hot, ultimately, or is thought to come from a Proto-European root related to heat. So it's the daylight portion of a full 24-hour period, what was hot or bright.
This is amazing, isn't it? There's this Sanskrit word, daha, which means a glow, but sort of specifically a glowing in the sky, which is clearly related to our word day.
Today we consider the full cycle of 24 hours to be an entire day, but originally it was more heavily contrasted with night, of course.
Yeah, and we have this other word that is related to how light or dark it is in the sky, and that is dusk. So we describe something that's a bit dark as dusky, and that is exactly the same word as when we're talking about dusk. It is the darkest part of the day that isn't night, which
That's
I
beautiful.
really like. And that word's undergone quite an interesting change since Anglo-Saxon times, since Old English, in which it was dux, D-U-X, instead of D-U, well, what we now spell D-U-S-K.
So we've had a metathesis there.
We've had a metathesis, like we have with ask and axe, which has been resurrected in the past couple of centuries, which I find quite interesting. And also I wanted to mention noon, because that was another one of these things that I found to be far more interesting than I was expecting when I looked it up. It comes from Latin nuna, which means the 9th hour of the day.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
So to you, what time is noon?
How do you get to 9 hours for noon?
Exactly. How do you? Well, noon was originally around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. So if you take the start of the day as being 6 a.m., which actually, if you're around the equator, that's precisely when the start of the day is. So it was originally 3 p.m. and then it moved forward to midday, noon, as it is now. And then later you get references to afternoon and before noon, and they become afternoon and forenoon. Forenoon we obviously don't use very much anymore for the morning, but at one time we did.
We have this recurring theme where a lot of time is measured in the period in which humans are active, which used to be when the sun was up, right?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it wasn't that important to talk about the time at night, right? while you're asleep, or to keep track of it.
Your mention of noon and dusk reminded me of a couple of other terms related to dusk or at a similar time. Another one being twilight, of course, being between light time because the sun is below the horizon at morning and evening. Originally, it was both. I think twilight, at least in my mind, strikes me more as an end of day phenomenon, but originally it referred to both morning and evening twilight hours. And another one, which is just a fun vocabulary word to have on hand, is the word crepuscular.
Ooh.
Which describes twilight hours, but also can describe species that come out at twilight or are active at twilight.
Crepuscular.
It's from the Latin word for twilight or dusk.
We must have mentioned before, I think we did mention in our episode about Shakespeare, but the word dawn is a Shakespeare coining. Before that, it is called the dawning, and he's the one that knocks off that ing.
Gotta I am those pentameters.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You've got to shoehorn in a word. Exactly. If it doesn't fit, chop it in half.
or add bits onto it.
Yeah, he's not beyond that either, of course.
But should we talk about different ways of figuring time, since we're on the notion of like our impression of time and the passage of it was different in the past, and it's still different in some regions?
Yeah, we should talk about that, because what I was saying about noon being the 9th hour of the day, or what we now call 3 p.m. and they used to call noon, being the ninth hour of the day. That fits in perfectly with the way that the time is still told in Swahili, because in Swahili, the day starts at 6 a.m. and ends at 6 p.m. Why? Because countries where it's spoken are on the equator and it's stable. So you can pretty much say that, the sun's coming up at 6, it's going down at 6. And so in Swahili, 7 o'clock is 1 o'clock, which
Huh.
is confusing, but kind of neat that this has been sustained.
Time resets at sunrise. That makes sense to me.
Yeah. And if you have a look at a Swahili clock, you can sometimes get them. You'll see that 6 is at the top of the clock, 12 is at the bottom. And so therefore, what is 7, as I just mentioned, would be 1, and then 8 is 2. And it goes around like that. And you basically have the day broken up into 2 halves, where you go from 1 to 12 twice. One of them is in the morning, one of them is in the afternoon. So it's not 24-hour clock. It's 2 lots of 12. That's we commonly do it in English as well.
A few variations throughout history too, like Babylonian hours divided daylight into 12 parts. So an hour was longer in summer and shorter in winter. So it was always 12 hours. And then in Roman timekeeping, they also used 12 daylight hours that were recalculated daily. So water clocks and sundials required constant seasonal adjustment. And then, of course, there's monastic time, because medieval monasteries marked hours by bells and prayers, not clocks. So it was more event-driven than uniform.
It does make sense, right? I mean, if you're in your own little bubble and you're not having to deal with people far afield, you don't really need these sort of fixed reference points that are shared with everyone else, do they? They can just be based around when your tea time happens, or when a certain mass happens, which is likely why noon they bothered to name noon at all. There was probably some sort of mass going on at that time of day that deserved a name.
At a community level, cyclical or event-based timing makes more sense for the things you need to know about your day.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the de-Christianization of time was the driver behind quite an interesting change that happened in France after the French Revolution. Yeah, well, they introduced their own calendar, and this all happens at around about the same sort of time as they're introducing the decimal system for everything else. They introduce a new French revolutionary calendar that breaks the year up into 12 months, sure, but all of them are 30 days long, and each of those months is broken up into 3 10-day long weeks.
Huh.
And they had a very interesting name for one of these weeks. They called it a decade.
Ah.
But that decade referred to 10 days rather than 10 years. Obviously, it would have been a décade in French. But they went, even more minute than that. They decimalized time as well. So in France, between 1794 and 1800, so it didn't last very long. It wasn't terribly sustainable. The day was divided into 10 decimal hours. Each decimal hour was divided into 100 decimal minutes, and each decimal minute into 100 decimal seconds. So there were 100,000 decimal seconds to a French day back then.
This kind of reminds me of in our numbers and mathematics episode, we talked about the difference between like the base 12 system, the duodecimal system, versus the metric and 10 and the base 10 and everything else. Which I mean,
it's a sexagesimal system. Just before we expand into the week, something that anyone who moves to Germany, and actually if you learn, I think a lot of other Germanic languages do this too, you learn very quickly that if you say, for example, 1:30, as I would commonly say for 1:30, other people are not going to turn up at the same time as you.
Oh.
Here in Germany, 1:30, also 1:30, is actually 1:30. So they're going to turn up at 12:30.
Interesting.
How has this been allowed to happen? So I do find here that people, I don't know if it's just when they're speaking to me, because I'm a foreigner, do tend to say, 1:30. If they want me to be there at 1:30, they wouldn't say 1:30, 1:30 instead, because it's a real sort of tiny little niggling culture clash that must cause so many problems, so many missed meetings.
And of course, we would phrase that pretty differently. We would be, half past whatever hour, which is, I think, a little clearer.
I mean, the reason it gets confusing, obviously, is the way that and I think some people think it's a bit uncouth, would say 1:30 instead of 1:30. Yeah.
Mhm.
Whereas the literal translation of half one to halb eins, yes, that is 1:30, which is 12:30. But
Huh.
halb nach eins would presumably be understood as 1:30, or I don't know, half a minute after one. They can be very precise, the Germans, where they want to be.
Those
Yeah.
implied prepositions causing chaos left and right.
Well, quite. Oh, we should mention Filipino time. The joke goes in the Philippines that Filipino time is being late.
That's what I've heard from my Indian friends about Indian Standard Time, is that you
Yeah.
show up an hour late.
There are a lot of cultures that
Mm.
claim a similar thing about their own timekeeping, which is very self-aware of them.
Speaking of like half one or phrases like that, I have a Scottish friend, and I was in Cannes about this time a few years ago for the Cannes Lions Film Festival, not film festival, the advertising festival, and our group was deciding where we were going to meet up later. We decided, and our Scottish friend said 6:30, and we were like, because it didn't sound like 6:30.
I see.
There was a bit.
So tell us about a week. Should we get onto the week?
The word week is also quite old in English. It was a word for the same concept we have now, but literally meant a turning or a succession. And it shares the same Proto-Indo-European root as words like vice versa and vicarious.
Oh.
The 7-day week itself is not based on solar or lunar cycles, but it has roots in Babylonian astronomy and religious tradition, which associated each day with one of the 7 classical planets. And then this was adopted kind of across Europe and incorporated by Romans into their calendar, which assigned Latin names to the days based on planetary deities. And then Germanic peoples translated these into names like Wednesday or Odin's Day and Thursday or Thor's Day.
So originally they're all named after deities, although sometimes
right.
we
now
keep
it's
the Roman
been all
deities
smushed together.
It's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
But an interesting theory surrounding where the word week comes from, and you mentioned it meaning a sort of a turning or a changing, and one of the theories is that it originally meant a sort of changing of duty, right? And so at the end of the 7-day cycle, all of the gods have had their turn. Now it's time for a change of duty, and we're back to the start. And one of the ideas that backs that up is that there's this old Icelandic term, which is very similar. It's vika, which means a distance traveled at sea. But they think that distance traveled at sea is how far you travel before you have to change the team of rowers over.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. So it's a change of duty there. So that sort of backs the idea up, which I like that.
Since we mentioned Wednesday and Thursday, should we just very briefly do the other days of the week?
Do it. Let's go for it.
Monday is Moon Day. Tuesday is Tuesday, the Germanic god of war. Friday is Freya's Day. Is that right?
Well,
I'm doing
I
this
think
off
it's
of memory.
I think it's Frigg's Day. It's generally thought to be Frigg. They're very similar figures, Freya and Frigg, but not exactly the same. Just like Wednesday is Odin, but it's Woden to the Anglo-Saxons,
and then we jump back to Latin with Saturday for Saturn, and then Sunday for the sun.
The sun. They're a bit of a mess. We did cover this in our episode about mythology. Very worth a watch or a listen as well. But yeah, fascinating stuff.
Did we cover the origin of the word calendar?
I don't think we did.
It is from the Latin candelarium, which means an account book or a register. So originally, a calendaria in Latin was a debt register because interest payments were due on the calends, the first day of the Roman month. The word calends traces back to calare, meaning to call out or proclaim, because Roman priests would observe the new moon and then publicly declare the first day of the month from the Capitol. So like literally just shouting dates out.
Does that make it related to the word call then? To call out?
That is a good question.
I'm really sort of postulating that. I don't expect you to know. It's quite interesting, isn't it?
I'm going to double check.
The word call doesn't sound Germanic to me.
So call is Germanic, but it is from the same Proto-Indo-European root. It did mean to call out in the same way and is related to calare. Other things that happen on calendars are solstices, which is the time when the sun stands still.
Literally what it means, right?
Yeah, solstice means sun
Right.
standing still. And then the equinox, equal night, again, literal translation right there.
Yeah, I like those ones. They're the ones where you hear what they mean. You go, oh, of course. And now I remember which they are, because I actually sometimes struggle to, well, I used to before I knew the etymology. Think, which is it, the solstice or the equinox? And you're like, oh, yeah, okay. Now I know that the sun stands still, you know what it means. And equinox, yeah, it's quite elegant.
Oddly enough, the reason the association I have here is there's a piece of music called Winter Solstice that helps me remember the positioning of each one. Since we've been talking about weeks and time periods and divisions of months, what is a fortnight?
Yeah, so this doesn't get used very much in the States, right?
I'm playing dumb. I know what it means. I think most people do, but I also don't want to assume too much. But you use it more frequently in conversation.
Yeah, yeah, and we really do use it. A few people said, you guys don't use it that much over there. So, no, I think I use a fortnight. When I need to refer to 2 weeks, then I refer to a fortnight. And it is a unit of 14 nights. And it comes from the Old English Fjorwertne nicht, which means 14 nights, believe it or not. And there was a counterpart that was Sjorvennichte, which meant 7 nights, and turned into another term, which was a sennight, which we don't use anymore. But it's a unit of 7 days. So it's a week. But here's an interesting thing that we don't differentiate between a lot in English, but other languages absolutely do. It's the difference between, well, for example, we talk about a day, and the word day can mean a unit of 24 hours. So at 3 p.m., I can say, I'll see you in a day, and it'll just mean 3 p.m. the next day. But a day is also 12 through till 24 o'clock, until the same time. Whereas a lot of languages will have a separate word for the unit of 24 hours and a day, the what you mark out on a calendar, for example. But we don't tend to do that. But we have had words that kind of do that. For example, we have the word year that we use now to mean the calendar year and a period of 12 months. And we differentiate between those in the way I just did by saying calendar year. But in the past, we also had the word 12-month, which we don't really use anymore. It is all one word. 12-month was in use from Old English. And that is a unit of 12 months, distinct from the year. We haven't lost that long ago. There's a folk song from the 1800s, All Around My Hat. People might know it. All around my hat, I will wear the green willow, and all around my hat for a 12-month and a day. But sorry for singing. But we don't use that anymore. So it's one of the sort of the time references that we've lost, alongside, we should mention, yesterday and overmorrow.
Yeah, right. We had more useful words.
Yeah, exactly. So yesterday is the day before yesterday. Overmorrow is the day after tomorrow. Here in Germany, they still got Übermorgen for the day after tomorrow, and Vorgestern. And you can have 4-4-gestern and 4-4-4-gestern. As you do that, you just go further and further back in time. But we've lost those words.
We should try to reintroduce yesterday and overmorrow. They're just so useful.
Yeah, I think I could well see us working in overmorrow because it sounds modern.
It also just sounds fun.
All we have to do is use it. Yesterday is a little bit, what do you mean But overmorrow, it's like, yeah, I think we could start slipping that. Let's all agree to slip overmorrow in. We'll try and slip it in sometime between now and the day after tomorrow. Can you tell us about month now?
Month. It's a month.
It's a month.
It is.
Yeah.
Month is related to, it basically means like a measurement. So it's related to words like ultimately to meter and dimension, and then like menstrual too, and menopause.
Semester as well, yeah. And trimester. I actually, trimester, I had a little bit of a revelation about this. I suppose probably while my wife was pregnant.
You learned a great deal about trimesters recently, didn't you?
But I'd always thought of the trimester when you're talking about pregnancy, because a pregnancy is 9 months and there are 3 trimesters. I was thinking, okay, so trimester means a division of 3, but it doesn't. It means 3 months, right? And obviously because it's 9 months. so it's trimester. The mester is month, tri is 3. And so semester, which again I thought, so a year is 12 months and a semester is 6. That sem must be semi, meaning half, but it's not. It means 6.
6. Does
Yeah.
it? Oh my
Yeah.
God, I didn't
It
know
comes
this
from
one.
the Latin for 6 months, not from the Latin for half month. I mean, now you think about it, it doesn't make sense.
I totally misunderstood that. Oh my goodness. Look at that.
Yeah.
Which is wild because semesters are not typically a course of 6 months anymore.
Yeah, well, I think it's one of those things where everyone's been confused about it. I mean, if you were confused by it, then like normal people will be confused by it.
Over here on our etymological alien planet.
but the moon's doing quite well out of all of this, isn't it? The moon has got both the day, Monday, named after it, and every month. Because obviously, basically a month is more or less a lunar cycle.
And it's because it makes a pretty good clock, like when you can see it.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it fills up and then empties away and then fills up and empties away. Yeah.
Good for navigation, all sorts of things. It's very useful. And you can see it and look at it rather than the stupid sun, which is going to burn your eyeballs.
Sun is absolutely useless.
So full of itself all the time. Doesn't even have phases.
Can I introduce you to an interesting concept here, though? While we're talking about sort of the phases of heavenly bodies, have you ever heard of the Platonic year or great year? It's sometimes called a great year or a Platonic year. You might have heard of it, but do you know what it is?
I have heard of it, but I would love an explanation.
So originally, by the way, okay, so there's two concepts here. The original Platonic year is the amount of time it basically takes the heavens to return to exactly the same point as they were before. And these measurements are done incredibly precisely. So it's not just like, how through the year you see Orion in the same position, once a year. It's not like that, because the Earth does something very, very subtle. It's on its axis, right? But its axis tilts very, 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 very slightly. So very slightly, and we know it's tilting, but as in it tilts off from its normal position at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years or so, right? And so that means if it's 1 degree every 72 years, you do 72 times 360, and you get a period of 25,920 years. That's how long it takes the Earth's axis, which is largely static, but is moving by this very small amount, to eventually get right back to its original position.
Huh.
And that is a great year. So it is 25,920 years. Although actually nowadays they talk about it as being 25,800 years. So they've got slightly more accurate description of how long that process takes. But it was Ptolemy said his teacher spotted this phenomenon, which is amazing how any human in that time could have comprehended this minuscule movement of the Earth's axis. So the fact that right now our axis points at the North Star, and we can use the North Star for navigation, that is temporary. It's going to stop being the case and will not be the case again for another over 25,000 years, which is pretty cool.
What does Plato have to do with this?
Yeah, I don't actually know. At some point, he must have postulated the same theory, I guess. Anyway, I jumped ahead there to a really, really big unit when we've just gone from months.
Earlier, we addressed year in relation to hour, but we did not address the meaning of year itself. The root that this comes from means both year and season. So it has often and long been understood as the cycle or completion of the sun's journey through the sky and the rotation of the earth. But the concept of a year has been described differently across civilizations for reasons we've already addressed.
How can they describe it as anything other than when the cold bit comes around again or the hot bit comes around again? Oh, I suppose if you're somewhere that doesn't have those seasons.
Well, because sometimes it was described as like a seasonal time instead of like the exact 365 days.
Right. Okay. Gosh.
And speaking of seasons, season means a sowing, essentially. It was used more generally until the 14th century when we decided there were 4 exact seasons, and they've been wibbly wobbly throughout time. Like we in the Roman calendar, we had this sort of period where we pretended January and February didn't exist.
Yeah, that's right.
Just our period in which we started planting our food, and then we decided how many seasons there were in a year.
I mean, I was saying about you not needing to keep track of what's going on at night. So,
Right. You
pretending
also
that there's no time there. You really don't need to keep track of what's going on at all in January and February in Europe because you ain't doing anything. Everything's dead.
You were trying to stay warm.
Yeah, exactly. Just hunker down, hibernate. Hibernate. Oh, that's nice. That evokes the French name for a season, hiver, which is winter. So yeah, hibernate just means to winterize yourself. Oh, and also I came across the other day the fact that in the States you tend to call it fall and we tend to call it autumn in England, but neither of those are sort of original terms for that season. They're both sort of exceptions within the Germanic languages, really, because none of the other ones call it anything to do with the leaves falling or use the French word, which is what the British do. But a lot of them call it harvest, basically their version of the word harvest. And that is what we called fall/autumn before we called it fall/autumn. It was harvest.
The sense of fall is like decaying and dying versus autumn, which means increase,
Yeah.
I would love to get into all of the names of the months and everything, but we've actually already done that on a different episode. So go ahead and we'll link to our calendar focused episode where we dig into the names of all the months and the differences between those over time.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of really fun Anglo-Saxon names for the months that you should definitely go and check. And also some quite scary names as well.
Blood month.
And then the one where you milk your cows extra as well. I like those. Tree Milky Mornath. Yeah, all the Anglo-Saxon month names had Mornath at the end of them as well, which is very helpful, but redundant. Although the ember at the end of it. Oh gosh, no, we've already done all this. Go and watch the other episode. Don't listen to me now. Shut up, Rob. How are we doing for this episode, Jess? Are we out of time?
I think we are out of time, though Tempest has Fugit.
Oh.
It's been a good one. I have enjoyed our time, and I look forward to further temporal adventures in the future.
See you in a prick. Take care.